So I think that over the last week or two, the debate over Israel's assault on Gaza in the kind of mainstream Western circles, that debate has in some fundamental sense ended. What I mean by ended is that it's now very rare to find people with any credibility in kind of mainstream circles vocally arguing that Israel, through continuing this assault on Gaza, can A, destroy Hamas, B, free the hostages, and C, do so without committing massive war crimes, including perhaps genocide. I think the voices that were arguing those three propositions, which were quite strong in mainstream Western circles, political circles, and in media circles, earlier on, have really, really faded. And we've even seen some people publicly apologize and say that they were wrong. Pierce Morgan, in a segment he did with Mehdi Hassan, basically said to Mehdi Hassan, you had opposed the war, I had supported the war, but I think now it's turned out that you were right, basically. Zadie Smith, the novelist who initially refused to oppose the war, has now signed a letter with a bunch of kind of important literary figures in Britain denouncing it. Um, but unfortunately, the way that the debate is ending in mainstream Western circles is not mostly with actions like Pierce Morgan or even Zadie Smith. It's mostly with people who had supporting the war vocally, essentially just not talking about it anymore, kind of turning the conversation somewhere else. So if you look you look at high profile defenders of Israel who have kind of credibility and large presences in kind of mainstream Western discourse, what you tend to find is much, much, much more discussion of anti-Semitism, and a lot of discussion of Iran, but really much less actually defense of this war as being capable of achieving its aims with, kind of an acceptable humanitarian cost. And I think, unfortunately, this is the way that I've noticed over the years that this is the way and the debates generally end, at least in the United States, the ones that I followed, which is to say, debates don't end with one side saying publicly, we were wrong. We recognize we were wrong. They end when one side basically just stops talking about the subject and kind of concedes by omission. So let's think about the debate about gay marriage, right? Those of us who are old enough will remember that this debate really raged in the 1990s, even into the early 2000s, with strong public voices arguing against it. You don't really see that much again in the kind of mainstream American media and political discussion anymore, but it's not like most of those people who were passionately against gay marriage came out and said, I was wrong. Mostly they basically just stopped talking about it and turned their conversation to other things. I think it was similar with Iraq. Most people who supported the Iraq War basically just kind of moved on and basically quietly kind of crept away from the scene of the catastrophe. And I think it's now it's worth saying that the debate, I'm talking about the West, the debate in Israel, I think is a bit different because the debate in Israel has this unusual feature to it, which is that most Israeli Jews want to end the war because they want to release hostages, but they also support mass expulsion of Palestinians, i.e., the Trump plan. So in a way, the pro-war position in Israel now, I think, is not that Israel can free the hostages, destroy Hamas at acceptable humanitarian cost. It's basically that Israel should free the hostages now, but its long-term goal should still be mass expulsion of Palestinians because the humanitarian concern isn't that great among kind of in the mainstream of Jewish Israelis, unfortunately. But when we talk about in the West, in the United States and Europe, I think it's really, really important to encourage people to end this debate in an upfront way, the kind of way that Pierce Morgan did by saying, you know what, I said something and it turned out I was wrong, as opposed to in the much more common way, which is basically to just quietly move away and start talking about other things and hope that nobody remembers that basically what you said a little while ago. And I think that to be honest, one of the reasons that people don't publicly go out and say that they were wrong is because people have a tendency to pillory them when they do, right? There's a bit of a tendency to kick people when they're down. They're like, aha, now we've got you. Now you admitted you were an idiot, right? And so one of the things I noticed about the response to Zadie Smith's public kind of letter in The Guardian was a lot of people saying, why the hell did it take you so long? Look at these terrible things that you said earlier on. And I mean, I really understand that. I understand that sentiment, especially when it's coming from people on the left, people on the pro-Palestinian left who are so used to getting kind of beaten up rhetorically and marginalized themselves, right? And kind of wanting and feeling, really angry at people who they feel like didn't take a courageous or thoughtful position early on, and kind of wanting to take this opportunity to now kind of to make it clear that those people how wrong they were, and basically to not want to give them any credit for recognizing something very late that most supporters of Palestinian rights and of course Palestinians themselves recognized very early on. But I think, although that's understandable, I think it's important to resist that tendency, and to kind of encourage people to come out and say that they were wrong. Because when people come out and say that they are wrong publicly, I think it invites them, or sometimes even forces them, to actually talk about what their assumptions were, about what their logic was, to think publicly about why they got it wrong in a way that actually can have implications for the positions they take in the future. That process of public reckoning is valuable, not because you can undo the harm of the position you took in the past, but because it can have a positive impact on the position you took in the future, right? I mean, one of the problems with America's foreign policy debate has for many years, for instance, has been that many people who supported military interventions that were disasters like Iraq were able to kind of resurface on and support military intervention in Iran. John Bolton is like a kind of paradigmatic case of this, right? And not be actually because they weren't really asked to actually really force themselves to publicly reckon with why they got this first military intervention wrong. And so it didn't have an impact on how they saw things in the future. And I say this as I think it's especially important that Biden administration officials, that people like Jake Sullivan, that people like Tony Blinken, that other top Biden officials who that they be invited and encouraged to come out publicly and say that they were wrong, as opposed to basically do what I think they seem to be doing now, which is basically just to try to avoid the subject, not do difficult interviews, not go and speak in places where they're going to be challenged on this, because it's super uncomfortable. It is going to be uncomfortable, but I think it's much better for people to say, we would rather you publicly come out and reckon and say why you're wrong than basically just pretend this didn't happen, because I think that will have an impact on the next Democratic administration. If people like Sullivan and Blinken and others publicly come out and say this, I think that sends a message to the next group of Democratic officials who will probably be in many cases, their deputies. So I think that's really valuable. And I say this as somebody who has spent a fair amount of my time talking about having been wrong, particularly about the Iraq War, although I've been publicly admitted being wrong about other things. And there have been times when I've been a little annoyed, to be honest, because I know that there were plenty of other people who supported the Iraq War who didn't really talk much about being wrong. And I think now I notice that not as many people remember what position they held to begin with. People who were, journalists, liberal journalists in particular. But I think one of the things that has been really valuable for me is that it has given me the opportunity to rethink things in ways that I think have been really, really valuable, necessary for me in my writing. And in general, I've been very grateful that people, including many people who were right in opposing the Iraq War, have generally been very gracious about how they've received this apology. And I think that's how we should be here. Again, I understand the rage that people feel, given the genocide that is happening in Gaza. But I think these public apologies make it more likely that this genocide will move towards an end, and that more fundamentally, the structural condition of Israeli impunity that has allowed this genocide to take place will end sooner, which it desperately must. There is, in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, this line from Rabbi Abahu, who says that in the place where penitents stand, even the most righteous do not stand. This is Jewish tradition. One of the reasons that human beings are considered better than angels, because angels don't sin, but human beings do, and therefore have the opportunity to do tshuva, to do repentance. Now, again, the Talmud speaks with many voices. I know that last week I talked about a passage in the Talmud which said there is no atonement for the sin of Chilul Hashem. So I think, again, one has to recognize that there are not these aren't hard and fast rules. There are perhaps certain things for which, again, there is no atonement, and we don't know at the end of the day fundamentally whether somebody can be atoned in terms of their own relationship with God. But I think what we can say is that in terms of the public discourse, in terms of bringing us to a place where this horrifying slaughter ends sooner and in which Israel can never do something like this again, we are much better off if people are encouraged to publicly come out and say they're wrong and grapple with why they're wrong so that it influences how they think in the future. That if people do what many I think are doing now, which is basically just quietly slinking away from this debate altogether because they realize that their position has been disproven, but they don't want to say so out loud.